Hello, and thank you for joining me at today's virtual event for Comsverse. My name is Ben Lee, and I'm the Microsoft Technology Lead at LoopUp. And I'm here to talk to you today about bringing telephony into Teams. What we are going to be looking at is split roughly into four sections or so. A little bit of some definitions up front about calling versus telephony and what the difference is inside Teams. Then something about the two main delivery methods. Technically, there's a third method kind of coming, but it's built around direct routing of either calling plans or direct routing to bring a telephony service over to Teams. And then lastly, we'll cover a little bit of the approach. So some of the stuff like user adoption and how you might approach actually migrating a site. So without further ado, let's get started. So calling versus telephony. In Teams, you can be signed in to the Teams client in many different locations. That could be your desktop PC or laptop, could be your Mac, it could be on your mobile phone, or it could be a device that's signed into a meeting room. And when you place a call, that call could be to another user on their computer or laptop where they're signed into Teams on a mobile device, or to another meeting room that is also enabled for Teams. Broadly, that is what I would call, calling inside Teams. That would be Teams calls, because it is end-to-end over some form of network and is usually an IP connection. When we talk about telephony, from all of those endpoints down the left-hand side where we can be signed in, if we place a call to a PSTN number, so a phone number somewhere else in the world, and PSTN is one of the few global standards, if you like, where it is possible to have a number in many different countries around the world. That is what I would usually define as a phone call inside Teams, or a telephone call inside Teams. And obviously, also there's the way that you can do telephony to make calls into Teams where you have an audio conferencing license and you can dial into meetings that you've created. So it's worth just touching on those two, actually, because the one on the right is what we're going to be talking about here. That is delivering telephony inside Teams as opposed to telephony inside Teams meetings. Telephony inside Teams meetings is a fairly straightforward proposition. There's one choice. You buy an audio conferencing license at the moment from Microsoft, and that will give you access to 70 or so shared numbers around the world. And you can add your own numbers or even toll-free numbers, again, subject to some licensing restrictions, but that means that a user who's got that capability enabled, when they generate a meeting, that meeting will have dial-in credentials to allow somebody to connect from a phone number. They don't have to have any sort of internet connection or IP connection. They can dial into that meeting and participate. So on the right-hand side for telephony, there's 2-3 choices about how you can choose to deliver that. The first one is calling plans, which is where you take your numbers from Microsoft, or you move your numbers to Microsoft and they become your carrier in effect. And you pay a licensing fee to Microsoft for a calling plan, and that's split in a number of different ways that we'll cover later. Or there is direct routing. Direct routing is a name for the technology that allows you to bring your own connectivity or bring your own trunk to the Teams service. So wherever you've got connectivity at the moment, you can, it doesn't matter if it's compatible or not directly with Teams, there will be a way that you can bring that to the Teams service. Or you can go to a partner like LoopUp who run a direct routing as a service product or platform or solution, and you can buy a service from them to take their numbers or port your numbers to them, and they might have different ways of slicing and dicing and charging and billing and augmentations that are different to calling plans, or maybe there's different coverage areas, etc. And the last one that it's worth just mentioning is there's a thing on the horizon called Operator Connect. Operator Connect is a way that large direct routing as a service providers can be hooked straight into the Teams admin console, and you can view, provision, request service from those carriers direct into your tenant without having to go outside of the Teams environment. So it's a way of kind of pulling those direct routing as a service platform providers directly through into your Teams tenant to bring some of the convenience that you get with calling plans of having, one interface, one management screen, with the benefits of direct routing, with flexibility, global coverage, multiple options for billing, etc., and pulling it all into one place. But Operator Connect is a program that isn't fully launched yet. It's something that's kind of on the horizon, and the full details aren't quite available yet. So the first one of these that I want to talk about is calling plans. The primary reason that you would want to go with Microsoft as your carrier the primary plus point is convenience. You know, you're already paying Microsoft for your Office 365 licensing, for your tenant, for everything for your users. So being able to take your numbers and your minutes, if you like, from Microsoft as well, just means that it all rolls into that monthly bill or yearly bill that you're paying to Microsoft already. But there are a few things that you need to consider. First of all, is the countries that calling plans cover. They don't cover most locations, or they don't cover all locations around the world. They cover quite a large portion of kind of America and Europe. But depending on where you've got offices and locations, it might be that calling plans just isn't an option for you. Also, you've got to consider licensing. So, to license calling plans, you have to have a phone system license. You have to have that to support any sort of telephony inside Teams, be that direct routing or calling plans. But then for calling plans, you have to have a license on top that gives you your minutes. And they come in a number of different varieties. The primary two are either domestic or domestic and international calling. That means that domestic, you can only dial numbers in your region, and international allows you to dial in your region and worldwide, subject to the restrictions that there are with dialing certain locations. And those do pool. So if you've got users in the States and they've all got the same type of license, you will end up with, if you've got 10 users, 10 licenses, those users will share a pool of 10 times whatever size license it is that you've got. And again, it's worth noting that calling plans come in kind of small, medium, large variants, depending on how many minutes you want to have. But that pooling only applies to people in the same region on the same licensing tier. So if you've got 10 users in the US, 10 users in the UK, you will only share two pools of 10 and 10. You won't have 20 across your company because, again, those pools of minutes and the allocation of minutes vary by region. And the last thing to kind of consider is the interoperability. You have to take your numbers from Microsoft, or you have to port your numbers to Microsoft. So if you've got equipment on site that you need to be able to interrupt with from Teams, you're not going to be able to do that natively using calling plans. And it might be that there are workarounds or other things like fax. You can port that to an e-fax service, or maybe you port stuff to POTS lines. But sometimes you might have other solutions or systems that you have to be able to dial. And with calling plans, you're not really going to be able to interrupt with that natively. From a country coverage point of view, this is the current list. As you can see, quite a large chunk of Europe, and there's two there on the right hand side in the Asia Pac region for Australia and for Japan that have got a little asterisk next to them. That's really to say that in those regions, Microsoft aren't providing the services natively themselves. That's through their carrier partnerships there. So in Australia, that's provided through Telstra, and in Japan, that's provided through SoftBank. There are, there are some countries that kind of pop up on the radar every now and again, but there's definitely kind of been a peak and a trough in terms of Microsoft and their coverage. I think that there's a bunch that have come online more recently, but we're not sure what the pipeline looks like. Like I say, if you get coverage in those locations, if that's where you have users, great, you can absolutely look to consider them. If not, you don't have a choice really, but to look at something like direct routing. Licensing, I think I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but just digging a little bit deeper, I mentioned there's small, medium, and large packages. Small package gives you approximately 120 minutes, medium would be 240, and large is either 1,200 or 3,000, depending on the location that you are. And where you've got domestic and international, it would be 600 minutes usually of international calls. The other thing it's worth noting is there is a license type called communications credits. That's something where you put a pot of money against your tenants, and then it's used for certain telephony related activities. So you could have toll-free dial-in numbers, and the charge of that toll-free dial-in when someone calls in comes out of that communications credit pot. Or it could be that you've got a user who primarily makes domestic calls and occasionally they want to make international ones. You don't necessarily have to give them a domestic and international calling plan. You could give them domestic and communications credits, and then they could change it. And it's important there on the pooling side, like I mentioned before, to kind of really consider, how you're going to divide those up amongst your users, because you want to make sure that you don't have too much overage or too much wastage each month of minutes that you're not able to spend. So you might want to do a little bit of, pretty comprehensive maths there to figure out what your usage will look like. From the interop and integration point of view, like I said, there's broadly two options for how you get numbers from Microsoft. You can through TAC, through the Teams admin console, go in and you can request new numbers, and you go through a process of saying, I want them in this country, in this geography, if they're available. It will give you a list, of how many numbers you've asked for, and you say, yes, I want them, or no, I don't, or you pick and choose some out of them. It is possible to do kind of a manual request by sending a support ticket to Microsoft where you want to maybe have 50 contiguous numbers that look a certain way. Or if your numbers, generally they're quite important to organizations because they support things like reception workflows and call flows, and people have them printed on business cards and that sort of stuff. You can port your numbers to Microsoft. And that porting process is the same as it would be to any carrier or any provider. That you fill in what's called an LOA form that details who the losing carrier is, what your primary billing number is. It goes away to the regional clearinghouse who validates that, and then a date and time is agreed between the losing party and the winning party for when those numbers migrate over between them. And then that porting process is fairly standard in the telephony world, and certain parts of the world it performs better than in others. Your mileage may vary. So that's kind of calling plans in a nutshell. The next one to look at is direct routing. So what do we mean when we talk about direct routing, and what's the primary reason that we want to consider using it for our deployment? Well, the main thing really is flexibility. Direct routing is where you have a form of SBC, which is a session border controller, that talks to the team service, and it talks to some form of downstream or upstream, depending on which way you look at it, connectivity. And that connectivity could be a SIP trunk connection to an existing PBX. It could be a SIP trunk connection to a carrier. It could be an ISDN connection where you've still got fixed lines coming into the building. It could even be analog lines that you've got coming in. The point is the team service doesn't care. The team service has to talk to an SBC, and the SBC has to know how to talk to something else. So effectively, it's a voice router. That's what its job is to deal with talking one thing on one side of it and another thing on the other side. And direct routing is great, like I say, from a flexibility point of view. And what do we mean by flexibility? Well, flexibility to choose the carrier that we're using, which means that we can have coverage in any location around the world that we want to, provided we're able to get some form of SBC and some form of downstream carrier to connect to it. Flexibility in the choice of gateway. There's a bunch of certified gateways, which we'll talk about in a minute, that you can use. You can do deep integrations if you want to, because that SBC can talk to multiple different endpoints, potentially subject to the model and configuration. But you can have that talk to 2 legacy PBXs, 3 legacy PBXs, a legacy PBX and a fax solution if you need to support analog lines at the same time. But again, maybe there's other things that you need to consider in there that maybe doing it that way, still you want to do what we did before about migrating fax to an eFax service or emergency lines to a POTS service. So there's not too many kind of complicated layers to make sure that service happens. And lastly, there's some choices about delivery. So, most people, when they think about direct routing, think about they would have gateways that they need to deploy and look after and feed and water themselves. But it could be that you come to a company like us, like LoopUp, where we provide a direct routing as a service platform where you can pay us a monthly fee, and we will take care of the carriers, the gateways, potentially managed service in your environment, looking after maintaining your users, support queries, ensuring the voice quality is okay. But again, the point is that it's direct routing as the underlying technology that kind of lets you take advantage of that. So digging a little deeper into carrier choices, it might be that you're tied into some contracts for a particular period of time. It might be that you've just renewed your PBX, but through the pandemic, Teams has come to the forefront in the organization, and you want to take advantage of telephony and turn it into that fully rounded UC&C platform. So you could do that with direct routing by taking, a gateway, deploying it there, still keeping those contracts for those lines that you've got. Or maybe you need to mix and match to get different carriers to provide you with service in different parts of the world. Or again, you can come talk to someone like us, because that's what we do, is we deal with those carriers on your behalf and get coverage. But again, it's direct routing that lets us do that. In terms of choices of gateways, there's a number of different vendors. The main two are Ribbon or Audio Codes, who provide the gateways that deal with this, but there are a number of different companies, and there's other vendors like Cisco have solutions that are certified now for use with direct routing, and that list is expanding. You can check out on docs from Microsoft where there's a full list under the direct routing prereqs that talk about things like what sort of certificates, DNS, network config, but also what versions of SBCs and what manufacturer of SBCs is supported for the platform. And actually, it could be that in your vendor selection, they all have their own different ways of dealing with routing en masse, or failover, or how they look at end-to-end quality across the SBC. So it might be that it's not just a selection of which SBC is sized correctly and the correct price point, but it might be which of those vendors have the additional tooling and things to support, you looking after the telephony platform, as a whole. And then from an integration point of view, compatibility. So, like I say, it could be that you need to interop down with some old school PBXs. You need to do analog integrations. Again, you can find a gateway that will have the right cables, connections, interconnects to allow you to do that. It also can allow you to do a smoother migration potentially. So you could have an on-prem SBC, hook that into your phone system, and start peeling numbers off in the routing on the SBC to say, actually, from Monday, this group of numbers or this group of users, some of them allow you to do AD integration, now route through to Teams instead of routing through to the PBX. So you don't have to do kind of a big bang approach necessarily. Not that there's anything wrong with that. As long as it's planned and project managed appropriately, it works. But with an SBC, you get a little bit more control over what sort of rate of change you want to go through when you're doing a migration or a deployment. And then lastly, we talked about the delivery choices. So that could be that you go self-hosted, and even self-hosted has a couple of different varieties. So it could be that you want to have an SBC deployed in your server room. It might be that you have one there from the Skype for Business days, because chances are a Skype for Business certified SBC is going to be capable of supporting the Teams workload through direct routing. Maybe with a license change, maybe with a bit of a dust down and reconfiguration, but chances are it will support that. Or it could be that you run a virtual SBC out of Azure. So you can have different flavors of direct routing if you're running it self-hosted, or you can go for partner hosted, which is where there are companies like us who will run those gateways on your behalf. And some, again, like us, maybe offer a hybrid solution. So maybe for a country like the UAE, where it isn't possible to have a cloud-based solution because of the legal requirements, you might have to have an on-prem SBC. But as part of the solution through that partner provider, they could allow 80% of your users around the world to be on the hosted platform, and they can deploy, support, maintain, look after an SBC through with a local carrier to help provide that 100% coverage of everybody in Teams the same way. And then lastly, there's the notion that I talked about of Operator Connect, where it is a program that large direct routing carriers or providers can bring their services and integrate it into the Teams admin console. At the moment, the configuration for direct routing is some of it can be done through the Teams admin console, through the GUI, but some of it still requires you to do PowerShell. So things like, for a user migration, particularly if you're migrating from maybe Skype on-prem, you need to make sure that you migrate the users to cloud, that you enable them in the right way, that you apply the right licenses, and then that you assign the right phone numbers to them. And the best way of doing that at the moment is through PowerShell. Whereas with Operator Connect, through those vendors, who are going to be part of that program, you will be able to view all the numbers that you've got associated with your contract. You could request new numbers, you could manage your porting process, you can allocate numbers. It gives you kind of a better experience and a little bit of that hybrid of some of the stuff that you get from calling plans combined with the benefits of going down a partner hosted direct routing method. So the next thing I kind of wanted to touch on is just a little matrix that shows some of the different parties that are involved when you are going for one of these solutions, because that might help influence your decision about which way you want to go. So if we look across the top, Those items at the top of the table, team service, application, etc., those are things that have to be up and running for your users to be able to make or receive a telephony call inside Teams. So the Teams service itself has to be running, and that is always going to be the responsibility of Microsoft. You always have to have the Teams application or a Teams device somewhere that is signed in, that is available, that they can access the service with. And usually that is going to be your responsibility. Usually you're responsible for the phones on the desk or the application on the mobile or the Windows 10 deployment with the Teams client on top of it. Then there has to be, some form of internet connectivity so that that client can talk to the Teams service. So that is usually going to be a portion of the company WAN and some form of ISP, either your corporate centralized internet breakout or a home user's, internet broadband. And again, that's pretty standard across the delivery methods down the left-hand side of calling plans, running your own direct routing, cloud-hosted direct routing, or partner-hosted direct routing. But the other kind of three, which is the SBC, so, there has to be, apart from with calling plans, an SBC somewhere that is doing the interop between Teams and the Microsoft service. That SBC has to have a connection to Office 365 to be able to support what it needs to do. And there has to be some form of upstream connection from that gateway, the PSTN connection. So on calling plans, there isn't technically an SBC in use, certainly not one that you see. And that SBC is always online because it's part of the Teams service. And then whoever the upstream carrier is, Microsoft, regardless of who the carrier is, because the carrier does vary by region behind the scenes, it's Microsoft who is managing and owning and dealing with that relationship. Whereas if we look at the next two down, the self-hosted or the cloud-hosted, taking the self-hosted, same three responsibilities for the same, first three items in our table. But the SBC hardware is then the responsibility of you. If that's in your data center, you have to give it power, you have to cool it, you have to make sure it's up and running, you have to patch it, you have to look after, the rule set on it, etc. And it's also your responsibility and your ISP's responsibility to make sure that it has connectivity to the internet. And then the same for the PSTN. You will be provisioning some form of downstream connection to that. And that is your responsibility and the carrier's responsibility to make sure that is up. But then if we look at the cloud-hosted direct routing model, where maybe you are running your own SBCs out of Azure in this example, that's why we've suddenly got, for those last three boxes, we've got Microsoft in the mix as well. So if you're running that SBC out of Azure, you need to look after it and you need to be running it, but we also need Azure to be up and running for, which is Microsoft's responsibility to make sure that that gateway is there. And sure, there are things you can do to architect at the global level to make sure you've got failover and all of that sort of stuff. But still, there's Microsoft in the mix there. Same with the connectivity to Office 365, and same with the connectivity to whoever the carrier is. And the carrier, if you're running an SBC out of Azure, it's going to have to be some form of SIP carrier. So you're going to probably have an internet trunk delivering to your SBC out of Azure, which is then passing through to the Teams service. All perfectly viable, all perfectly possible. Just be aware, though, that there are quite a few people in the mix. And then the last option is the partner-hosted direct routing. And sure, you've got the same complexities behind the scenes that are happening there. But actually, as far as an end-user customer is concerned, those last three items are all the responsibility of the partner. That's what you're paying the partner for. They can't make sure that your computers are up and running and users are signed into the Teams client. They can't make sure that your users can get to the internet. That's still on you and your ISP and on Microsoft. But from a hardware point of view, from making sure the SBCs are running, for making sure the SBCs have upstream connections, for making sure that those SBCs have connections to carriers and that there's dispersed connections to carriers in the event of failover of individual components, that is all stuff that a good partner should be working on behind the scenes so that you're paying them your monthly fee or whatever the arrangement may be, but that is then their responsibility to be dealing with. So just, thought it was kind of important to just have a little look at the not quite a racy, but a light touch on where some of those responsibilities and the differences might be in those approaches. So speaking of approach, this is a very rough attempt at what a decision tree might look like. Obviously in the real world, it's far more nuanced than this. And if you've got any particular questions and stuff, I'm going to be available at the Comsverse event in person. So feel free to come and find me. Loop Up as a sponsor there with a booth. Feel free to come talk to them. I'm happy to talk solution agnostically or technology agnostically. We're just here to kind of help make sure people get the best experience out of their Teams solution. But as a rough idea, if you're wanting to add telephony into Teams, there's a very basic question of, if you're deciding between direct routing and calling plans, does Microsoft have calling plan coverage in the countries that you want? If the answer is no, you have to go for some form of direct routing, be that self-hosted or partner-hosted. It doesn't matter. You don't have a choice. If Microsoft do provide the coverage that you need to then look at the licensing costs. Does it stack up, and does Microsoft allow you to bundle the minutes in a way that is economically viable for you as a business? Excuse me. If not, then you need to look at the business case of a direct routing solution. Do you need to have any interrupts? You remember back, 10 minutes ago, we were talking about gateways allow you to sort of sit between different systems and solutions. If you need any of that sort of stuff, then again, you're leaning more towards the direct routing way. If not, then your calling plans might be suitable for what you need, but there still might be some other sort of fringe considerations. So if we've landed at, that we want to do some form of direct routing, then one of the next steps would be, are there any interop or legal requirements? If there are, for example, like we said with UAE, you have to have calls breakouts in the country. So a cloud solution isn't something that is, ever going to be possible until the legalities in that country change. So you might have to have a gateway deployed on-prem. Now, that still doesn't mean that you have to run that yourself. It could be that the partner will run that for you, or you run it for you, but there has to be a physical gateway with some form of connectivity in that location. If not, then it comes down to the management costs. So, in that matrix that we're talking about, it's not just the costs of buying it as a service from a solution provider, but there's the costs of buying the gateway, supporting the gateway, whatever your licenses and your maintenance are, the downtime of patching, but those other elements as well of like running the auxiliary functions or pieces around the service. So you need to kind of look at those things together and then add up whether that's something that you want to run yourself or whether that's something that you would come to a partner for some help. And then the last thing really is, in terms of kind of approach or a project process, what might you do if you want to do a direct routing or a Teams calling plan deployment? Well, step one is you need to gather your information, and that's not just your number of minutes. It's not just, what numbers you've got in a particular location, but it's, in Teams, stuff happens in a slightly different way than it might have done on a physical PBX. Things like group call pickup is the functionality in Teams that lets you answer someone else's call or them send a call to you to answer. Whereas in a PBX world, that used to be, a form of hunting, or you had a special function on the phone that you press a button and an extension and it will pull the call over to you. But in a Teams world, when people have control over their telephony in a way that they can control the forwarding, they can control their delegates, they can control simultaneous ring, those sorts of features and functionality, and particularly when you've got presence in the mix, so you can add in some smarts about, well, I'm on DND, I'm sharing, don't send another call to me. Those things aren't necessarily something that you map one-to-one from, what you have against Teams. So you need to gather information about, raw numbers, raw usage, but also what features and functionality is used at the moment, and try and strip that back to what business process is sitting underneath it. Then you go to pilot. Migrate the first bunch of users, or set up some tests to replicate and validate your scenario. Then you go through to planning your migration. Are we porting? Are we getting new numbers? What's that going to look like? What sort of readiness do we need to do in those locations to make sure that the network is viable to support Teams telephony? What sort of readiness prep do we need to do? And then all of this stuff is really a cycle. So even if you've done it 10, 20, 30 times as you go around the world migrating offices and locations, you should always be looking in CQD, the core quality dashboard, to make sure that the user experience people are getting is the user experience that you want them to have, and feeding that back into your process to evolve it for next time. So I think that's kind of me at the end of my time here. Like I said, thank you very much for joining me. I am going to be at Comsverse in person. I'm presenting a session around the MS700 Microsoft exam for Teams and how you can prep for that. You can contact me on ben.lee@loopup.com, or you can contact our sales at sales@loopup.com if there's any questions, comments, further information, or anything that you would like to have. And I would be delighted to kind of hear how you found this talk today and how things went. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.